Hello, and welcome to the 80s Movie Podcast. I am your host, Edward Havens, publisher and editor of FilmJerk.com. Thank you for listening today. If you like what you hear and you haven't done so already, please make sure to rate and review the show on your favorite podcatching source. While a good review and rating won't increase our chances of being found or being featured on a podcatcher like Apple Podcasts or Spotify, it will potentially help increase the odds of someone who does find the show for the first time thinking that clicking play will be a good time investment for them. And it's something you can even do while you're listening to this episode. On this episode, we're going to be talking to cinema historian and UC Santa Barbara Film Studies professor Ross Melnick about his recently released book, Hollywood Embassies: How Movie Theaters Projected American Power Around the World, available from Columbia University Press, as well as what it's like to create an accredited university class on 1980s cinema. And finally, Ross will be my first guinea pig for a new segment I'll be introducing on this episode, where I will ask a film scholar or filmmaker to give me 5 movies from the 1980s, from any genre and any country, they feel does not get the kind of attention those movies deserve from modern audiences. And for the record, Ross did not share his list with me in advance, so as I write and record this intro, his titles are a mystery to me. If you love movies and love movie theaters, Ross Melnick is someone I think you should know. I first became aware of Ross in the early 2000s when he and his partner Patrick Crowley created the Cinema Treasures website, which could be described in a 1980s high-concept way as the IMDb of movie theaters. In 2004, Ross and co-author Andreas Fuchs published their coffee table book, Cinema Treasures: A New Look at Classic Movie Theaters, which examined the cultural and industrial history of theatrical motion picture exhibition in the United States from its humble beginnings in the late 19th century up to the early 21st century. The book was lauded by Leonard Maltin as a treasure and was named as the Theater Historical Society of America's Book of the Year in 2005. Both the book and the website are both regularly utilized by myself, both for personal memories of theaters long gone and occasionally as a research tool for this show. In 2012, Ross published American Showman, an incredible 600-page tome about New York movie theater impresario Samuel Roxy Rothafel, who helped to create the lavish movie theaters of the 1910s and 1920s that helped to make the movies a national pastime. And in 2017, Ross was named an Academy Film Scholar by the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences, one of only 2 scholars who were bestowed this honor by the Academy that year, which came with a grant that would help him finish the new book. I finally got to meet Ross in person in October 2009 when he gave a series of 6 lectures over 6 months for members of the California and Nevada chapter of the National Association of Theater Owners, which covered the history of motion picture exhibition and included a vast number of rare pieces of movie ephemera, from a Vitaphone record from 1928, the first year of synchronized sound in movies, and an exhibit of most every format of film used in theatrical exhibition over the first century of cinema. I'm proud to call Ross a friend, and I'm also very grateful that he took some time out of his very busy schedule to spend a little time to talk to me. So without further ado, here is my discussion with Ross, which was recorded over 3 sessions in late June and early July of 2022. You've just released your 3rd book, Hollywood's Embassies. You've written extensively about movies from the point of view of exhibition, first with your 2004 book, Cinema Treasures, a beautiful coffee table exploration of the various movie-going eras and the theaters audience loved and loved to hate. Then in 2012, you released American Showman, a nearly 600-page tome on the life and career of famed early 20th century film exhibitor Roxy Rothafel. And now Hollywood's Embassies, a sort of cautionary tale about how local cultures could both embrace and sometimes violently attack American movies and cultures. How did you come to arrive on the topic of Hollywood's Embassies?
Well, ironically, and first of all, thank you for having me on your amazing podcast. Ironically, this actually came out of the research I was doing on Roxy. And by full admission, I should say that the idea for Roxy came up in 2002, and the original idea for this book came up in 2003. So even though I began working on it in earnest in 2012, once the American Showman book was over, I've actually been working on this for almost 20 years. And the reason that I came up with this idea was that I was researching Roxy and was suddenly noticing that a number of his employees were being sent to Paris. And I was trying to figure out why would MGM and Lowe's send their employees to Paris to a movie theater overseas in 1925, 26, and 27? It didn't make any sense. And what I discovered was that Gaumont, and a French company, and MGM had made a deal whereby Gaumont would allow Lowe's and MGM to operate its theaters as well as its distribution operations in the mid to late 1920s. This led me to, okay, so MGM was doing this in France. Then I discovered Paramount, of course, opened its own cinema in Paris, Le Paramount. Then I was looking at the London MGM cinema and the London Paramounts. And then over the period when I first began poking around, this is in the zeros, or the aughts, if you will, I started realizing this was actually a much larger expanse of time. And actually, I used the Cinema Treasures website to track down some of these names. Where were all the Paramounts? Where were all the Metro cinemas and the Metro theaters? And so as I began the list, I started in 2011, 2012, once the American Showman book was off to the publisher, to start working on this in earnest. So I think in the beginning, I had about 12 countries. I was aware of about, that Fox and MGM and Paramount and Warner Brothers had theaters in about 12 countries. And then over the last 10 years, I would discover MGM cinemas in Trinidad. And then I would look, suddenly there was a Fox theater in Lima, Peru. And so it began this long expanse. And so it was a sort of a joke between me and my publisher. We would meet every year at the national conference for lunch. And he'd say, well, what's the number up to now? And I'd say, well, now we're at 22 countries. And so it began this long kind of march. And so, I really had to discover in a way how to contain this huge history. The book stretches from 1923 to 2013. The book stretches over 36 countries. And so originally I had this idea that I was going to do it chronologically. I was going to sort of do it, we'll go through the 20s and the 30s, and you'll kind of see how this expansive history grew. And then that way you'd be able to talk about all these things happening synchronous. And what I discovered was that was a really complex way of doing it. It would just end up being kind of lists. And now they're here and now they're there. And what started showing up in my research was that if you want to really understand what Hollywood was doing overseas, you had to understand it regionally. So it made much more sense to talk about how Hollywood would construct a region, even though they were completely different. As if Paramount's operations in China would be the same as Japan, and yet they would appoint a head of the quote unquote Far East. They would appoint a head of Australasia, even if their operations in Australia and New Zealand were completely different. And so they constructed these regions so in a way it made a certain amount of sense. So the book, as it is now, is organized regionally, but then within those regions, it has a kind of chronological sweep.
And you would actually travel the world over the course of 10 years to not just visit the theaters, but find additional research. And if I remember, places like the Cinémathèque Française, if I remember right.
Yes, I went to the Cinémathèque Française. I went to, many of the Cinémathèque Brasileira in Sao Paulo. So, there really was and the Tel Aviv Cinémathèque. So the book required a lot of on-the-ground research. There would have been even more. There were a number of research trips that were supposed to happen at the beginning of the pandemic, all of which I had to cancel. But I was able to travel pretty extensively to Brazil, to Italy, France, England, Israel, Australia, New Zealand, and more in order to try to figure out as much of this as you can. Because what I discovered is that you need to go to the National Archives, the National Library, if there are national cinema archives. I would talk to local executives. I would visit the theaters that were still there. I'd visit with people who knew and who had gone to those cinemas. So it was it was a huge kind of undertaking. It benefited from all kinds of historical societies as well as governmental institutions which had kept records on these things, because like all theater research, there are virtually no corporate archives. There are virtually no personal archives. Unfortunately, companies change, theaters close, and you end up doing a lot of exterior research, if you will, to these companies, and that enables you to figure out what's going on. And so I discovered with every country, you had to attack it in a different way. Sometimes you would go into, the state archives would have that information. And sometimes it was actually a matter of picking up as much of the trade discourse that was happening. Sometimes it was as much of trying to understand the newspapers, what was going on. I did lean a lot on the National Archives of the United States and England, which actually contained a lot of the State Department and Commerce Department records, because one thing that was really important for both the British Foreign Office and the U.S. State and Commerce Departments was that these theaters operating overseas were really important to the U.S. missions, because a lot of this was Cold War, a lot of this was post-World War II. And these theaters were, as I discussed, called them, the cultural embassies. They were the kind of front-facing privately run but front-facing operations, if you will, of the U.S. cultural mission. And the embassies and consulates understood that that studios were sort of expressing the American ideals and American consumerism and American entertainment on these very, very visible architectural edifices in the middle of downtown streets. Mm-hmm. And so that gave them a lot of importance. And they were as much known by their architecture as they were known for their entertainment. And so they were celebrated as such and criticized, and as you mentioned, sometimes attacked for that very prominence. And so I was really trying to interested in that story.
Yeah, because for me, one of the things that I've constantly found it interesting as I'm reading the book is that when my wife and I travel overseas, whether it was Paris or Scotland or wherever, Mexico City, I like to go to a movie in a foreign country. Now I'm usually seeing an American movie at a foreign theater. But for me, it's just seeing the architecture of how these various theaters. There's when we went to France in 2017, there were these great old movie palaces in Aix-en-Provence. Not a big town, but they had 3 movie theaters in there, and only one of them had been built after like 1960. One of the theaters was named after Renoir, but it was great that the 3 movie theaters in this town were actually named after some of the most famous French filmmakers of the past century. And I just love going. So when we go to Thailand in December, my wife is like, just figure out which theater you want to go to now, and it's a little hard to do that research from California of what movie theaters are like in Bangkok. Mm-hmm. So I kind of envy you that you got to travel the world to do the research. But one of the things I love about the book as a longtime theater manager and movie theater lover is that even sometimes with my knowledge and expertise in the exhibition industry, is that I'm still learning about these things in the history of the global film exhibition industry that you are teaching me. I was especially intrigued by the concept of the shop window that you go into at first in the British section, the first section of the book. For my listeners who haven't picked up the book yet, can you briefly explain what the shop window concept was, like with the Plaza Theatre in London in the mid-1920s?
So, this is a kind of British trade nomenclature. The shop window was an idea that essentially this premier venue, this premier movie house, served as a kind of display. So that's why you think of it as a sort of shop window. It was a display feature, if you will, for not just how to present these films to the local population, but it also attracted exhibitors from outside London to come in to see how Paramount would put on movies at the Plaza, or later how the MGM would put on films at the Empire. And so it was a display. So in other words, you were advertising your wares, you were attracting people into the premiere presentation. So especially if you think about these films when the theaters when they opened, 25, 26, 27, these are still silent movie houses. So presenting a film meant how you scored it, if there was live performance, so a stage show, if how you would accompany it with music, how you might adorn it with newsreels and shorts. In other words, and then how the lobby was organized, how the displays in the lobby were, how the marquee was advertised. All of this was the kind of shop window for not just the films that Paramount and MGM were displaying, but also a kind of exhibition practice and a kind of movie-going culture, which Hollywood was really interested in disseminating and influencing overseas. And there's a real business reason for this, which is that they really wanted exhibitors overseas to charge more money. Because if they charged more money, they'd collect more at the box office, and that would, of course, give them more foreign revenue. So they had a real interest in kind of presenting this very, very souped up, very kind of consumerist, exotic, opulent affair at these shop window cinemas. So these shop windows, again, had the twofold idea, which was that, number one, they were very exciting, very popular amongst people who were living in London and would attract moviegoers. And then, of course, they were there almost like trade screenings to demonstrate to exhibitors both in London and outside once the film moved, because remember that they're giving the films to their own theaters first. So right. They would play exclusively at those theaters before they would ever go to Birmingham or Newcastle or anywhere else. So it really was a way for them to say, you're waiting for, Written on the Wind, but you're not going to get it till later, but here's how we would present it. So that's the sort of idea.
Which is kind of what happened in America in the 30s and 40s and 50s, where a movie would showcase if a Paramount movie would showcase at the Paramount Theater in downtown Los Angeles, and it would play as long as audiences were willing to drive downtown and deal with it. And then it would go out to the suburban houses after that. So in the ways, it was a lot much like the American way of doing things at the same time. Because I know like Gone with the Wind would play at the downtown theaters for a year or 2 years, or even in some places 3 years before it would ever go out past the company-owned cinemas. So another thing I find interesting in the book is that you spend nearly a century examining how American culture was being exported to other countries, not through just the films, but through the cinemas. And then we're ending the book with the trend of foreign companies like China's Dalian Wanda, India's Reliance Media, Mexico's Cinepolis, and South Korea's CGV entering the American exhibition markets, and sometimes not just buying companies. Like when I worked for AMC in the early 2010s, they were bought by Dalian Wanda. But some companies like CVG were opening their own theaters, like here in Los Angeles and down in Buena Park, where they're not just building their own theaters, but they're bringing, South Korean movies into these markets that might not otherwise be playing South Korean movies, much like how theaters like the Kwowa in the San Gabriel Valley were bringing Hong Kong movies uncut, hopefully with subtitles. But 2 years, I was watching Jackie Chan movies 2 years before they would get picked up by New Line or Miramax, and seeing them the way they were presented. So why do you think the tables got turned in that last 15-year period or so?
Well, there's a couple of very obvious reasons why this happened. One is that, in some cases, there was a real growth overseas of circuits that were building very quickly. So Cinepolis did extremely well, and they looked for foreign expansion, not just in the US, but also in India and well beyond. You also have, of course, Dalian Wanda's expansive growth across the world, buying up AMC, Carmike, Hoyts, Odeon, many others. And so you have very popular, very successful corporations that were growing up. The other thing is that the U.S. film industry was no longer that interested, and I think this is a two-part answer. One is that this whole discussion in the book begins in a very different moment for Hollywood, which is a vertically integrated Hollywood, where they made films and they distributed films and they exhibited those films. Between 48 and 59, that was dissolved by the U.S. Justice Department consent decree, which all the studios were divorced from theater holdings. But even so, the studios actually maintained the foreign holdings. That's the sort of strangeness of how this shook out, which is that it wasn't the separated theater companies like Lowe's or Stanley Warner. It was actually the studios which kept their foreign exhibition operations. But by the time you get into the late 1960s and 70s and even into the early 80s, almost all the studios had sold off their foreign theater chains. Mm-hmm. So they weren't that interested. So that kept Hollywood and American media out. And then I don't think it's unfair to say that the late 90s were very difficult for the theater business in the US. There was a lot of bankruptcy reorganization. There was a lot of heavy debt from building a large number of megaplexes in the late 90s. And so I think, those kind of venture capital firms that had come in and swooped in and bought those companies had tried to sell them off, which is what happened with Lowe's and AMC. So I think what had been very attractive about the U.S. market was it was susceptible to foreign investment. And so that meant that that what was actually happening overseas was huge growth in exhibition operations in Eastern Europe, South America, the Middle East, and certainly Asia. So a lot of the growth markets were actually outside the US. And as those companies grew and they were very successful very quickly, it actually enabled, it facilitated the investment in the US.
Right.
So, and I think the other thing about you were mentioning CJCGV, this very successful, very, very successful South Korean company, which has theaters in South Korea and Vietnam and China, as well as the US. The interesting thing about them is that they kind of put in the same model in a way that the Americans did before. They had this thing that they call the kind of cultureplex. Mm-hmm. And it's this idea that the movie house is not just a place for movies, but it's a way of kind of celebrating and enjoying Korean cinema and Korean books and Korean food. And so I think that some of them have adopted that, and other ones have just recognized that there's power in volume and power in international operations. Having said that, that power that lasted until 2019 was completely upended by the pandemic.
Right.
And so what looked like a great idea in 2019 was pretty tough by the time you ended up in mid 2020. That looked like a lot of debt and a lot of real estate you had to figure out what to do with. And we don't have to go through the rest of that story.
Yeah. Okay, so let's switch gears to your work as a professor of cinema and media studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, my brother's alma mater. Your courses have included Global Film Exhibition, which about your book, the history of the New Wave films and international cinema from the 1989 to the present. And of course, the class that piqued my interest was 151 AE, American Film and Culture in the 1980s, which you taught in the winter of 2019. So how popular was that class, and what goes into creating a term-length curriculum about 1980s?
Well, one thing I should say is we're on the quarter system. It's a little bit of a minutia, but it's kind of important, which is that, unlike a semester system where you might have 14, 15 weeks, I get 10.
Okay.
So I have to be very concise about these things. So the way that, first of all, the courses, I will say, is very, very popular, because I think that Gen Z and before then millennials and certainly others, there's a love affair with the 80s. I don't have to tell you that, and I certainly have to tell Stranger Things fans and anybody else that people love the 1980s. I grew up in the 1980s, so actually the class was a bit of a dare, an intellectual dare for me, because I had always experienced the 80s as a consumer and as a child and as a teenager. I think I was really motivated to do the class because a lot of people have a very negative opinion about 80s cinema, and it is disregarded, and I think it is often dismissed as not an important era of cinema, and I reject that. Certainly after teaching the class several times and seeing the absolute love affair that my students have with the 1980s, and also seeing how important films were in the 1980s, and even the films that we sort of think were bubblegum popcorn movies, I have to say, Hollywood and filmmakers and screenwriters were still trying to make a lot of commentary, even in those films. You look at the sort of critique of corporations and greed, and even kind of a corporate fascism that's in RoboCop, co-written by Michael Miner and directed by Paul Verhoeven. So many of the films of the 1980s have social and other critiques built into them. So, I can't always say that about our contemporary films, that if you watch them closely, there's always something that people are a message that people are trying to get within the popcorn. So I discovered in doing the 1980s class that the way that I wanted to teach it, and forgive me if this is boring, but I have an American Studies undergraduate degree. So the way that I approached it was actually a way of using 1980s films and to get into the kind of social, cultural, political moment of that era. And so what I decided to do was actually start in 1982. And the reason for that is that, you can't just decades don't turn on a dime. That doesn't happen, number one. Number two, if you just understand anything about production development, films take a while to be greenlit. They take a while to be directed and produced and distributed. And so really 82 was this kind of liminal moment for me. When you look at a film like First Blood, it's a 70s film with an 80s end, with like an 80s ending, and so you start to see this pivot into these films. And so by the time you get into 83, 84, 85, you're starting to see the sort of influence of the Reagan era. You see the decline of a certain kind of filmmaking in the 1970s. The films are somewhat shorter. They're becoming a bit more commercially oriented. The narratives begin to change. But what I tried to do with that class is, so we would look at 1982, 83, and 84, and every week would be a different year. So we started in 82 and 83. We will look at two films from that year and try to decipher what's happening with race relations, feminism, what's happening with the economy, what's happening with the morning in America or election, political news. And so seeing how filmmakers deal with these kinds of concepts. So even things like two back-to-back films about immigration, which is two films I'll talk about. You have some questions about films I showed, but El Norte and Moscow on the Hudson are really two fascinating films in thinking about immigration in America, because they are very, very, weirdly enough, they're very, very contemporary in terms of conversation. And I should say, University of California, Santa Barbara, where I teach, is an Hispanic-serving institution. So we are a very diverse university with a lot of students who come from many places, as well as students who are also coming internationally to study there. So these are the kind of films that really do resonate in terms of the conversation that they come up with in terms of politics and even thinking about what has changed in the 40 years since these films and what has not, and what are the kind of current themes.
Yeah. So what were some of the movies that you showed to your students during the class?
Well, I don't have the syllabus in front of me, but I will say those are certainly two of those films that I showed. One thing that's kind of interesting is looking at the end of the 1980s, just as an example. In 1989, you have Glory, Driving Miss Daisy, and Do the Right Thing, which if you're trying to figure out what's happening in the 1980s, I will say, in the beginning of the 80s, there's a lot of conversation. We always, in that class, look at a lot of music video. Because I think you need to look at music video if you're trying to figure out what's happening in filmmaking trends. Certainly, our recent conversation about Top Gun brings us back to Tony Scott and the kind of filmmaking aesthetic of the 80s. But, there's really very, very few Black leads in Hollywood films in the early 1980s. And you start to see things change in the mid 80s. And you have to get through films that you can't believe were made, films like Soul Man, which still is just one of those films that you sort of stare at and go, I see what you were going for, but I think you may have made a mistake. And it's just one of those films that, and so we don't look at that film in total, but we certainly do look at a clip of it. Because I think one thing that's really interesting sometimes is to see the distance between the world you live in and the world that there was. And I think that's the hardest thing sometimes for understanding where films come from, is understanding the world that they emanate from. What were the kind of social mores at the time? What were the sort of ideas? But anyway, moving into this idea of the end of this, it's really interesting to see those three films. Again, Glory, Driving Miss Daisy, Do the Right Thing, only one by a Black filmmaker, but it's very interesting to see those three films in conversation with each other, because you are starting to see the 1990s creeping in to the very end of the 1980s, that Reagan is leaving. And there's this conversation about what are the narratives and voices of the 80s that have been left out. And I think that white filmmakers and Black filmmakers are trying to produce that information through cinema. And you start to see things like Roger and Me, Michael Moore's film, which is coming in 1989, which is also giving you that sense of like, here's some things about the 80s we didn't talk about during the 80s. And now that we're getting towards the end of this, here's the things that, and this is, people forget that Roger and Me is Warner Brothers.
Right.
And that Do the Right Thing is Universal. These are not indie film companies. These are major studios, distributing very, very socially relevant films in the late 1980s, and Glory is Columbia Pictures. So it's kind of amazing, or TriStar actually, released by Sony. So you are seeing, and Driving Miss Daisy, I believe is Warner Brothers. So, everyone is involved in this kind of, I think the studios are starting to figure out that they need to begin talking to a new generation of filmmakers, and they also need to begin to have different kinds of stories. I mean, I'm also interested in films like Dead Poets Society and Witness, which are both Peter Weir films, who's a great Australian filmmaker coming to the US. And those kinds of films are, saying two different things. Witness is a film that's really about this collision between the pastoral, the rural, and the urban. It's one of the thousands of critiques of the inner city, quote unquote, in 1980s films. I mean, it's amazing how much cities are often seen as hellscapes in 1980s films. I mean, it's like even those sort of suburban films like Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead. It's like whenever the kids go into the city, it's like it's just nothing but danger,
Adventures in Babysitting too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like it's those kinds of. Maybe I'm thinking of that film actually. These are not films I show, by the way. But those are the kinds of films where it's one of the crazy things about Ferris Bueller's Day Off that I've always enjoyed is that the greatest film about an 80s rebel is a guy who goes to the Mercantile Exchange and the Art Museum.
Right.
I just couldn't imagine a 2022 film about a rebellious teenager that everybody loves. Is like his day off is a French restaurant, the Mercantile Exchange, and the Art Museum. But
and a baseball game.
And a baseball game. But you have to be you have to be a man of the people somewhere while driving your convertible.
Yeah, because I've talked about, like the last days of the 80s being like the last bastion of non-corporate filmmaking. Because if you look at, I already talked about David Putnam's time at Columbia, but then you look at the late 80s, you have Warner Brothers releasing French films about jazz, and you are allowing Clint Eastwood to make a movie about Charlie Parker, and then you've got Roger and Me, and it's like these are films that no Hollywood studio has touched in 15 or 20 years, where now we have gone back to franchises, which was actually kind of big in the 60s and 70s and kind of slid off a little bit. And then you see the rise of the 80s. In fact, one of the reasons why Putnam got kicked out of Columbia was because he refused to make Ghostbusters 2 when the powers that be desperately wanted Ghostbusters 2. So for me, one of the great things about the 80s was always just how there was such diversity, even at the studio level, where movies like even into the early 90s, you get Hudsucker Proxy is still Warner Brothers, but you kind of lose that in the last 20 years once the clock turns over to Y2K.
I mean, I think this is one of the things that's really fascinating about the early 80s. I mean, Cruising, William Friedkin's film, Reds, Warren Beatty, Chariots of Fire is also Warner Brothers. I mean, these films, there's no studios that would release these films at this stage. I mean, Cruising is one of those films that was, extremely controversial when it came out. But it's in Reds, an almost 4-hour, epic about, a journalist getting involved in, the Russian Revolution. Yeah. And it's a period piece. It's an epic. It's kind of a love triangle. It's one of those films that, that you just, you don't see anymore, and you won't, because what would happen with Reds now is that Reds would be a limited series on Netflix. It wouldn't be a feature film. And so it just reflects not just a change in filmmaking styles, but it reflects a change in corporate culture, and reflects a change in how the changes to the American film industry, which having to do with either, corporate changes, streaming viewing habits, et cetera, really do influence the way content is produced and distributed and released.
So that brings us to, this is the first time I'm asking somebody, you're going to be my guinea pig for this experiment. But I want to start talking to people who are film lovers about the movies of the 1980s that they feel have fallen out of favor, either because of a lack of availability or the gatekeepers spend more time talking about other more popular movies. So as I've shared with my listeners, you have not given me your list. You've hinted at a couple things. But I have no idea what you're going to say. So this is just going to be two guys who love films talking about 80s movies. So the list, this is the top 5 Ross Melnick 1980 movies that deserve more love today than they get. What's your number 1 pick?
Well, let me preface this, because I think you set it up in a way that I think is very smart, but I don't want to undercut what I actually think.
Okay.
Which is that, first of all, there was a list of like 15 films that I came up with, and I think they all deserve a certain attention. I also think I wouldn't want to rank them like this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are just, in my opinion, these are 5 films that I think if you haven't seen them or you haven't seen them lately, they have a certain resonance that I think is important to go look at. Okay. So I'm not going to rank them. I'm going to do these 5 just because I think they're worth talking about.
Okay.
The first one is El Norte, 1983, Gregory Nava. Mm-hmm. Now, many people remember seeing it once. Many people haven't seen it at all. And I think if you're someone who's been paying attention to the country's long conversation about immigration, I think this is a film that requires a lot more viewing and even some discussion. Because like another film I'm going to mention in a few minutes, I think the thing that's really interesting about the film is that it presents a complicated notion, not just from the side of sort of American exploitation of workers who come, but why do people leave places like Guatemala to come to the United States? And it does that by personalizing the stories of a brother and sister trying to make it to the north, to El Norte.
Right.
It's also a beautiful film. It's beautifully shot. It's got this kind of magical realism towards the beginning and then a very stark kind of realism towards the end. And I think that is a very... I think it's a really a film worth watching, and I think it's a film that might open up a few minds and even a few hearts for people who have just sort of thought about closing the border to everybody. I think there's something really about that film that still resonates. And I think what resonates is it's a very human story, and its politics are secondary to the human story. So that's what I would say is the first one I would want to bring up. Is there more that you'd like me to discuss, Edward?
No, I actually was at a IFP seminar many years ago with Gregory Nava, the co-writer and director of El Norte, nominated for an Oscar for Best Original Screenplay. And one of the things that I found most fascinating about this, because when I saw it when it came out, I was 15 or 16. I wasn't quite in the mindset of screenwriting yet. And so it was fascinating to me to hear him talk about how he set the story up. Screenwriters are told do things in a 3-act structure. And he actually explained that when he and his co-writer were working on the screenplay, they actually structured it as a 4-act story because of the way that he wanted to tell a story. And I went and rewatched the movie. I hadn't seen it in 20 years at that point. And because this was like early 2000s. And I was just fascinated at how my perception of the movie changed now that I knew this one little thing from the mind of a screenwriter. It's like, oh, it's not set up like a traditional movie where you have specific breaks at specific moments. He actually broke it up into smaller sections because that's what he felt the story needed. And I absolutely agree. El Norte is one of those movies that is absolute required viewing regardless of what's going on in the world. But it has a strange way of becoming relevant again and again and again, even though it's almost 40 years old. But
and it's on the National Film Registry, so it was also, deemed to be a culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant film. And I think it is. It's one of those that, it's also what I also find about it that's interesting is that it's an independent film before the independent film boom. Mm-hmm. So it's actually an independently financed film that was funded in part by PBS, but that isn't part of the kind of what we think of later as the sort of Orion, Miramax, Searchlight. It's not part of that world of indie filmmaking. It's an independent film that was sort of seeking a way to be seen. And I should tell you, maybe this is dating myself, but I actually the way I saw this film the first time was actually in a middle school social sciences class. So I saw this movie as quote unquote sort of cultural education. And then I returned to it many years later for its cinematic qualities. And so that's one that I think if you've never seen El Norte, I think for what you said, the three segment structure that Nava wrote with his ex-wife Anna Thomas, and then the way that the film is shot. It's a gorgeous film, much of it shot in Mexico to get that sort of local flavor. So there's really, it's really worth taking a look at.
Yeah, 100% agree. And it's also just this little side note. Gregory Nava was one of the original creators of the IFP, the Independent Feature Project, which is now known as giving out the Spirit Awards, the independent Oscars, as it were, the night before the Oscars. But he wanted to share his experience of making this movie specifically with other independent filmmakers because there wasn't that big of an independent film community yet in the early 80s. So there's so many reasons why this film is so significant as a movie and as part of a movie culture. So thank you very much for bringing that up because it is a movie that I've been wanting to talk about for a long time that I just haven't figured out a way to get into yet. So we will definitely talk about that movie more another time.
It's a great film. And this is a less heralded film, but I think it's also about immigration, and I think it's one to think about. But this time not coming from Guatemala and Mexico, but coming from what was then the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. I'm speaking of the 1984 Paul Mazursky film, Moscow on the Hudson, which you're chuckling, which I think is appropriate because who would pick Moscow on the Hudson? Okay, one of the reasons I picked this film is because obviously we're speaking now in July of 2022, so we're having a little bit of a kind of a neo-Cold War return, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's on my mind. But more to the point was I was recently, for Cinema Chargers, coming up with a variety of really poignant July 4th Independence Day scenes. I think the opening of Avalon was in there. There was the Independence Day parade in 1990. The Independence Day parade that's in Glory from 1989. And the other one was the coffee shop scene that's towards the end of Moscow on the Hudson. Now, at this point, and I should say this is Robin Williams stars as a defector who defects to the United States in New York. And then he comes to New York City at the height of New York's craziness, right? It's not quite the 70s, but it's full of, dirt and crime and craziness, and the kind of city still trying to find its way after the 1970s. And so, on one hand, he's comes to the U.S. for all the promise, but then he finds all the realities that are inherent in our country. And he then, of course, meets another immigrant played by Maria Conchita Alonso. He has a wonderful Cuban lawyer. There's this great scene at the end of the movie where he's sitting at a coffee shop. He's with his lawyer, and he's talking about how terrible, how crazy this place is. And there's another Russian man who sees him at the coffee shop. And he begins to tell him off like that. He says, this is a great country. And suddenly you notice everybody in the coffee shop, someone's from China, someone's perhaps from the Dominican Republic. Everyone's from somewhere else, right? It's a classic New York scene. And he sees in that moment the whole promise and craziness of the United States. And it's another immigrant story, but from a different perspective. And the other thing is it starts out sort of as a very interesting drama, has these comedic moments, but I think it's a touching look at why people come to the U.S. And I think it's a 20th century vision of why people come to the U.S. It's come from probably a very Jewish American perspective, a kind of European, why did people in the late 19th, early 20th century immigrate to the U.S.? And then many decades later, as a filmmaker, trying to sort of understand why people are still drawn here and what is the magic of this place amidst all of the craziness. So it's this bittersweet look at America and New York in the 1980s. And I like it because we think of the 80s as, the kind of the glitzy glam of Wall Street, John Hughes, this kind of, risky business, Top Gun, kind of a high octane 80s. This is a very, very different tone. This is a very different sensibility. And it's the other side of the Yakov-Smirnoff 80s, where everyone, if you just would leave Russia, everything would be great in the U.S. And Robin Williams has another take, his character, which is that it's wonderful. He has these touching letters he writes home, which he narrates. And there's the famous scene where he's used to going to supermarkets markets in the Soviet Union, and he gets coffee if they have it. Right. So he goes to the supermarket for the first time, and there are like 35 different brands of coffee, and he has a nervous breakdown. And he also learns about race relations in America, which is an eye-opener to him. And so it's a really interesting conversation. So right in the middle of the kind of height of the Cold War, any suspicion of someone who would be un-American, and yet Marczewski makes this movie that both challenges and affirms supposedly the greatness of the United States. So it's a very, very interesting film. And I think it's also just another amazing Robin Williams performance. So I would say that's one to watch if you've never seen it.
Again, agreed. And the reason I was laughing when you mentioned it is that when the movie was being made, Paul Mazursky's lawyer was a family friend of mine, Jeff Taylor, who eventually became Mazursky's producer. Worked on he was an associate producer on Moscow on the Hudson, and then went on to produce Moon Over Parador and worked on Down Out in Beverly Hills. So when you said that, it brought me back to Jeff was like one of the people that I didn't lean on when I wanted to be a filmmaker that I should have. So, and I remember when Moscow on the Hudson came out, my interest in it was not just because I'm a Robin Williams fan. And at 16, I'm not quite knowledgeable about who Mazursky is as a filmmaker. But that's Jeff. I have Christmas dinner. I spend Christmases and Thanksgivings and all these holidays with his mom at their house in Palm Springs. And so, I've heard of this movie as it's being made. And then I finally get to see it and just have my little 16-year-old mind blown at how subtle Robin Williams' performance is. It's even more subtle in many ways than Garp, which was really mind-blowing. And if Garp's on your list, I'm sorry if I stomped over it. But that's but yeah, it was like it was like the movie for me that solidified Robin Williams as not just a comedy legend, but a great actor. That Garp was not a fluke. That he was building towards a better career, a bigger career. So I'm with you there, and it's actually one that I need to watch again. It's been way too long since I've watched Moscow on the Hudson.
It will reward you. I should say, World According to Garp should have reminded me not to become a professor. That's the sort of ultimate lesson of that film. But it's a great film. It's not on my list because, but I actually think, in a weird way, World According to Garp is actually more overlooked than Moscow on the Hudson, but it's still not here. And I would say, to your point about subtlety, yeah, when you think about Dead Poet Society, where he has he's up and down, or even Good Will Hunting, this is a tremendously restrained performance that's really worth watching. So Moscow on the Hudson. And I should say, since you brought up Paul Marczewski again, go for the triple bill. Go for Down in Beverly Hills, which is really the perfect expression of mid-'80s Los Angeles. And then Moon Over Parador, which is, there's so many things I could say about that film. It was such a guilty pleasure as a kid. And I would say just a great Sonia Braga, Richard Dreyfuss performance, and also a strange Jonathan Winters appearance, but really an interesting film, interesting premise, and and again, a Cold War film that's really kind of interesting, and a commentary, a deep commentary on America's politics in Central and South America. So, Marczewski is, what I love about his films is that he's that kind of sort of soft political filmmaker. Mm-hmm. Like he gets his politics in very subtly, and just enough that you know where he's headed, but he doesn't make you think, oh, this is all set up for politics. It's really an interesting 3 films in a row: Moscow on the Hudson, Down in Beverly Hills, and Moon Over Parador. And I think those are the highlights of the sort of 80s career. He has this very serious and very incredible 70s and late 60s career, but the 80s, those 3, it's really kind of dead on. And Enemies is a whole other conversation.
Yeah, right. and then also if you go right before that, he did Tempest with John Cassavetes, which is, if you look at what he was doing in the 70s and the early 80s, you go from Tempest to Moscow on the Hudson. That's about as far a right turn as any filmmaker can make in their career and still be a legend. But it just, it was a great movie, but it just came out at the wrong time in '84, Moscow on the Hudson, because we were, in the grips of Reaganomics and Reagan mania, and he was riding high. He was going to win his re-election that year, and it really had a lot of pointed barbs specifically at the Reagan world, and those who I think might watch it today who weren't alive and conscious back then in the 80s will see it far differently than you and I will, but still it's just one that, if you want to understand where the world was in that time frame, that's a movie that gives you a very macro look at a specific point of view from just one person, but it's such an amazing point of view. I'm with you there.
So I'm going to shift a little bit to another conversation about the Soviet Union, and this time it's to Reds, Warren Beatty's Reds, which is, you need to carve out at minimum 4 hours of your life, 3 hours plus to watch it, and maybe an hour afterwards to figure out how he was able to make it. And then you have to know it has this incredibly long development. But for those who haven't seen it, Beatty co-wrote it, produced it, directed it, and it's this sprawling epic about John Reed, who covered the kind of Russian Revolution, and it's got a great cast: Diane Keaton, Jack Nicholson, Warren Beatty. So you're also, if nothing else, these are 3 actors who were at the top of their game, working in this incredible, sprawling historical epic. But the thing that really, I think, makes it incredible is the interviews. The interviews that he conducts, the documentary interviews that he conducts with people who were there, who knew the players that the film depicts. And it provides a kind of guidance. I hadn't seen it again. It reminded me that I thought, when I watched Interstellar, I kind of thought that the interviews that were conducted about the Dust Bowl made me think that Nolan had stared at Reds in making that film, because it provides this kind of seriousness. It provides this kind of melancholy, and yet this texture to the film, that what you're watching is from a real place, and that the story is bigger than what you're seeing, and yet it's no bigger than these titanic figures, Eugene O'Neill and others who are involved in this film. It's a marvel. It's the kind of film you could tell was began in the 1970s. It's the kind of film they didn't let you make 5 years later.
Oh, no.
The studios wouldn't make that later. But in the early 1980s, you still had, again, Chariots of Fire, Gandhi, Reds. They were still churning out the big epics, the kind of biopics, and these films that were really much more attuned to the previous decade. And Reds is just this, and a lot of people say it doesn't totally work. That it's sometimes it's a romance and sometimes it's a drama. I think it's everything, and I think it's also a testament to Beatty. If you want to see a guy who's putting his power in the industry at that time, his time, his effort, his money, his prestige on the line for a film that's really about, talking about what are the tenets of communism. What were the values of those people? Why did people in the 1910s on the American side, why were they interested in this? What were the problems in America? So again, you have, and sort of thinking about Moscow on the Hudson, you have this complicated conversation of, this is a movie, late 70s, early 80s, it's a 1981 release. But it's also about what might be wrong, with the politics here that make, John Reed want to go over there and stare at Russia in that period. And then you have, Paul Sorvino and actually Jerzy Kaczynski before he passed away, and all these incredible figures who were standing in for historical characters. It's one of those epic films that they just don't make anymore.
It's my favorite movie of 1981. And I'm saying that as both a 13-year-old in 1981 and as a almost 55-year-old many years later. I had no idea what I was getting myself into when I went to see Reds. And to a young teenager learning about this history that wasn't being taught in school. I don't think this stuff was taught at your school, and I know it wasn't taught at my school. And I grew up in a very liberal town. Not quite communist or socialist, but very, very liberal. And this is stuff that I never learned in school. So, and as I get older and I learn more about the power Beatty had in the industry, that he could get Charlie Bluhdorn of Paramount Pictures, a fairly notorious cheapskate, head of Gulf and Western, who loved to buy companies left and right, but loved to nickel and dime everything. He got $30 million in the late 70s to make a 3+ hour epic about an American writer in Russia during the communist revolution, and got all these major movie stars. And then on top of that, decided, I'm going to interview a whole bunch of people who either were there, or people like Studs Terkel, who are, major historical studies of, the way Studs Terkel, that's where I learned who Studs Terkel was in Reds. And I started devouring his work. Outside of everything else of the movie, it's just like that guy, the way he told his stories in the movie. I know I'm jumping off of my original thought, but just like this movie was devastating to somebody who was thinking about, maybe I want to be a filmmaker, that can be a movie from a major studio in the 1980s. But then as you get older, you start to realize, well, he actually made it before Reagan was elected president. He got it financed before this major shift in the conservative movement. And now to see that movie today and to think that somebody, we talk about Hollywood being so liberal and stuff like that, but this is outside of what even most liberals would be able to get away with back then. And just that's how much power he had, where he made what? He made Shampoo in 75. and then he made Heaven Can Wait in 78, and then he made this in 81. He's like one of the biggest movie stars in the world, and he spent a decade concentrating on getting this movie right. And if I'm remembering right, he was only the second person ever to be nominated for producer, director, screenwriter, and actor at the Oscars the same year, the first being Orson Welles for Citizen Kane. And it's like, that's the level of expertise that Beatty had on just his second movie as a director, and technically his first as a sole director, where he won the Best Director award that year. It should have won Best Picture, because as much as I like Chariots of Fire and as much as I appreciate what Hugh Hudson did with it, Reds was on a different level from everything else that came out that year. I think you were a lot younger than I was back then. So you were
not
like
that much younger, and I was born in 75. So
yeah, so you were like 6.
I was 6, but
and I was, I was 13 or 14.
Yes, I was younger than you, but I will say this: we watched this film as a kid. I saw this film at least twice because my parents either rented it or owned it. And I remember it well, and I was probably 10 the first time I watched it, and I didn't get it all. But the one thing I got from it was just what a dedication it took to make it. And I think if you think about all those awards that it was nominated for, et cetera, it's because everybody in the business knew how hard it was to make a film like this. Mm-hmm. And I think it's sort of, number one, of course, reputation and admiration within the business just for him. But I think it's also, this film is, it's like, as you just said with Bluthorn, the ultimate capitalist made the movie about the ultimate communist.
Right.
And so it's the dichotomy of the whole thing is the magic of, if there is a magic of the movies, if there is a sort of like, what's unique about America, it's that that exists, that this thing got made, and it's a marvel, and it's one of those things too that the film, if you recall, takes time to actually go through the rallies. I mean, these are things that would be removed now from like they wouldn't get through the cut. Like you'd watch them on the director's cut. The extended cut would have, but they go and make the speeches. You actually watch them on the party floor making speeches. So, whether you care about how this faction believes in this and this and other, they do the party platform. So you get this feeling that you are literally in that moment. And that texture is what's amazing about the film. It's not just watching Beatty do the biopic and watching the romance and the drama and the kind of the tragedy of various things that happen in the movie, but it's also that they really try to marinate you in the moment, and that's what, again, those interviews do. They put you back in a moment where people felt like the world was changing and that the world really was, right, the 10 days that shook the world. It really was a transformative moment, and this was a transformative guy at this was this slice, and all the people talking are telling you exactly that he was a man, right? And so on one hand, they're kind of, he's valorized as all biopics do, and on the other hand, all the foibles, all the shortcomings, all those things.
And then Rob Reiner rips it off for When Harry Met Sally brilliantly. Does almost the exact same thing, but unless you're paying attention, you might not even know that it's a direct homage / parody of what Beatty was doing. But
it works. Yeah, it works. Okay, next one.
Next one.
Okay, now here's where I'm probably getting into some trouble. And I'll take it because I'd like to believe we're at that moment where we can divorce the filmmaker from the film. But I will say, if you've never sat down to watch Radio Days, 1987, from a certain director with the last name Allen, it's a film that's really unique. We don't make movies like this. They don't make movies like this because the film is it's essentially an hour and a half radio play. It's a series of vignettes, radio stories structured around a film.
Yep.
And you have this kind of again, it's a period. Maybe obviously you can see where my head is at, but it's a period film, and it's a period film about family. It's a period film about connectivity. How does entertainment and technology connect people, and how does memory work? and what constitutes memories. And because the entire thing is a kind of flashback memory, but then there's these incredible radio stories, and there's some very early appearances. Danny Aiello has a great one, but it's a fantastic kind of it's like a tone poem in a way to a bygone era of the 30s and 40s. It's also a really interesting look at the American home front in the 1940s. And so if you can't get past the fact that Woody Allen directed it, perhaps you can at least try to stare at it for how do you make almost a kind of experimental film of using radio structure to construct a kind of memory, one person's memory of what it was like to be alive in that period, and how much the radio structured everything, and how much people of that period recall not the television that they saw because it didn't exist, or how much people remembered being on their iPhones, but how people were connected by this other device which infiltrated everything and then creates a soundscape that ultimately constructs the film itself.
All right. I love Radiohead, Radio Days. Sorry. I don't know why I said Radiohead. I'll edit that out. But if I was going to be talking about a Woody Allen movie from the 80s that doesn't get as much attention, I probably would have said The Purple Rose of Cairo, simply because of
very movie-going of you.
Yeah, because of the moviegoer thing. I actually got into a conversation with somebody a couple of nights ago at a trivia game, because one of the questions was about Van Johnson, who has a small role in Purple Rose of Cairo, a small but memorable role. And it just, I have Purple Rose on Cairo on DVD. I probably bought it 10 years ago, and I still have not watched it. But just the whole idea of a movie character coming off the movie screen to interact with real humans, and then have the actor who plays that character come to town to try to talk his fictional character to go back on the screen. It's basically a much better Last Action Hero, but with Jeff Daniels instead of Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yeah, Last Action Hero is 100%, obviously riffing on Purple Rose of Cairo. But have you ever seen Escape from Liberty Cinema?
I have not, and I've got it on my list of things to do someday.
There's your Polish Purple Rose of Cairo, which actually references Purple Rose of Cairo in it, and is this wonderful film about the fading days of censorship in late 1980s Soviet Poland, and about then suddenly Purple Rose of Cairo comes to Poland, and it's like a question of like what they can show, and once again, actor leaves the scene, and it's a really interesting meta film. You're already in a meta film. Now you're in a meta film, and then in typical Hollywood with Last Action Hero, which I enjoy to a certain extent for its kind of, it has some great sequences of being on the sea 42nd Street before it all got torn down, and right. There's a lot of kind of interesting ideas in that movie. But it's a film that obviously is very much reflective of Purple Rose of Cairo, but with, of course, a kind of Arnold Schwarzenegger, action sequence blown into it. So it's a really interesting film to look at what 13 years actually, what 13 years can bring you.
Yep.
But yes, there are many films from that period, but I just think the reason I chose Radio Days is most people just haven't seen it.
Yeah.
The radio in and of it just takes people out. And then it's kind of a nonlinear film. It's not really following any one plot line. There are multiple plot lines that kind of intersect. It's got a very slight Tarantino structure to it, if you will, where they come back together. It's a really interesting film, but it's also one of the most sweetly nostalgic films I think any American filmmaker has ever made.
All right. And your final film for this recording?
I am leaving the United States and I'm going to Hong Kong for A Better Tomorrow. Now, look, A Better Tomorrow is not an unknown film. A Better Tomorrow is well known to anyone who cares about Hong Kong cinema, anyone who likes John Woo. But, it's sort of my plug to say, please watch A Better Tomorrow.
Yeah.
And it's the Leslie Chung and, of course, the coming out party for Chow Yun-fat. I mean, I think if you want to see what it looks like when a star gets born on screen, I think it's A Better Tomorrow. It's also, my favorite thing about A Better Tomorrow is that it is a male weepy. And so when I've shown it to students, I've always asked them to please don't laugh. Like they need, it's the younger generations, because we've so drenched the world in cynicism, and and kind of sarcasm. It's hard for people to understand that the melodrama that John Woo means, that's in this and The Killer, it's that he means it to be exactly this dramatic and melodramatic and emotional. And I love the fact that it's both this incredible action film, it's a great gangster film, and it's also one that is deeply about the brotherhood, right? This kind of bond between men, and this whole notion of honor, and also just incredible action sequences. But it's also just fantastic acting.
It's a fantastic movie, and it's one that, after The Killer, that it kind of got left to the wayside, and I think it's if you didn't have A Better Tomorrow, we wouldn't have John Woo, period. We wouldn't have Chow Yun-fat, period. So, fantastic call. And since we have a couple minutes left, why don't you just run down the other 10 films if you have them?
Oh. Well, let me see. I have the list here. Okay, well, some of these are very, very well known, but I still wanted to talk about them, which was, and I'll go through the list. They Live. Come on, great John Carpenter. You got to watch that. Cinema Paradiso, which is very well known, but I still thought Witness. Come on, a fantastic film. These are all films that people have seen, but should watch again. And I have two others that I will mention at the very end, which are really interesting. The continuing on would be Amadeus. People just haven't watched that in a long time. Great Milos Forman. I do think Dead Poets Society, one of several Peter Weir films of the 80s that really deserve it. And then this weird double bill of To Live and Die in L.A. and Cruising. Cruising is finally out of the doghouse. For a long time, it was known as the most homophobic film ever. And it's gotten this kind of... it's been reanimated in a way that people are starting to sort of see it as this very interesting film that's not quite as terrible as people remembered it. So there's been some very interesting academic writing on it that I think you can now talk about it without fearing its problems. And I think To Live and Die in L.A. for mood and aesthetic and Willem Dafoe, I was so tempted. I think To Live and Die in L.A. was number 6. I have so many great things to say about that film because most people haven't seen it. And if they're thinking mid-'80s Defoe, they're thinking Platoon. Right. But I really have to recommend To Live and Die in L.A.
Yeah, I actually did an entire show on To Live and Die in L.A. About a year and a half ago because it was the 35th anniversary that week. And that freeway where that chase takes place on is only a few miles from my house. And I regularly drive it to get brunch for my wife. In fact, I even drove it today because it's the quickest way to get there from my house to there. So it was, To Live and Die in L.A. is one of my favorite undersung movies. It was literally Freidkin's last blast. And it's sad to realize that the film was never that big of a success. And it is absolutely a movie that deserves
it's like the
love.
Smart version of Beverly Hills Cop 2. Beverly, because they both kind of deal with the LA oil fields, and they both deal with this sort of counter Los Angeles that's not about extraction and opportunity, but about exploitation and theft. And it's a very interesting film. The other thing I love about the film is that, like a lot of films that take place in Soho and New York, it really deals in emptiness, this kind of empty, this sort of the solo sax, the warehouse, the idea that there's these emptiness spaces that I love about 80s movies where someone has a giant loft, someone can have an entire warehouse, and there isn't this kind of dirty clutter that the 70s were so great at creating. The 80s have this weird emptiness sometimes in the architecture that I love so much. And To Live and Die in LA is just sort of empty spaces, empty buildings, and even the sort of sparse kind of soundtrack and score. Sometimes there's this fantastic emptiness about 80s movies that I love so much. Anyway, so that's something that's also really fascinating about To Live and Die in LA.
Yeah, and actually, I remember seeing To Live and Die in LA. It might have been the Cinerama Dome, but I don't remember. I do remember seeing it somewhere in Hollywood in October, November '85, and John Turturro shows up for one scene, and it's like, who is that guy? He's this nervous ball of energy, and he's drinking Pepto-Bismol the entire scene. He's only got one scene, and I think I became a John Turturro fan from his one moment in To Live and Die in LA, and then he just kept showing up in all these movies. Like, and for the longest time, it was, hey, that's the guy from To Live and Die in LA. And then you've got, it's kind of started the resurgence of Dean Stockwell, and I think it's the first time I saw Steve James, the great black exploitation actor, who kind of fell out of favor for a while and then kind of fell back into favor after it. And I honestly think it was Friedkin's last great movie. It just was sad to see him start to have a career resurgence again and then just kind of disappear.
Without critiquing other directors, it's interesting. You look at some of the films that some of the great 70s directors made, Coppola and others in the 1980s, and some people just it's either there's a moment, there's the material, there's their own what's only going on in their head, or what the studios will greenlight. But it's interesting. There's a number of filmmakers who just that transition into the 1980s did not go as well as they would have hoped.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, and then you were talking about the other double feature with Cruising. I hate to say I've never seen Cruising.
Cruising is one of the craziest films that a Hollywood star has ever been in.
Yeah,
it's a problematic film, but it is an eminently fascinating film. It's the story of Al Pacino, who goes undercover. Someone is killing gay men, right, and he's a detective and goes undercover. But what's interesting about the film is also what's problematic. It's its depiction of the community. There was a huge protest by the gay community because of its depiction when it was being made, even in production. So at this point, it's now kind of being revisited as a very interesting film that kind of captures a moment of time. There are just things in the film, scenes in the film that, again, it's kind of a little bit like Reds. You can't quite believe Hollywood would make this film 5 years later or 10 years later. Mm-hmm. And it's a tribute in a way to, I guess, what Friedkin's sensibility, and also that Pacino was excited to play this role, in which I think his own the sense of whether or not he's a good guy or he's not is also up for grabs. Right. And it's just, there's 1,000 interesting things I could say about Cruising.
Yeah, the only two things that I really know about Cruising outside of it's a Friedkin movie, Al Pacino, undercover detective, gay bars in New York. The only two things I know about it is that one of my favorite LA punk bands, the Germs, did some of the music for it, and if I remember right, appears in a scene in the movie. And that James Franco made a little independent production about a scene that was rumored to have been shot for the movie that has apparently never been seen, but it becomes one of these urban legends. And before Franco fell out of favor, he decided, oh, this is something I want to do. I want to make this meta movie about a scene that may not have ever even happened.
There's this period of film, and I think it's probably between, say, 79 and 82, which we don't consider the 80s because, as you know, just the way that development works. You write something in 1979, it finally gets bought, it goes in production in 80, maybe finally comes out in 81, maybe even 82. So the whole notion of Reagan being elected and the shift from Carter and the shift into a new kind of decade, it's not going to be read in that early period. Right. So the films that are coming out there, and I've always sort of looked at First Blood as this liminal space because First Blood has some of the hallmarks of a 70s movie, but it turns into this kind of, rugged, individualistic, kind of action film with a happy ending at the end. So it's that moment, that 1982 moment, that shift. And Cruising is in the early part of that. Cruising is 1,000% a 70s movie. Yeah, it doesn't even know Cruising doesn't even know the 80s are happening, other than the fact that it's being shot in this kind of very late 70s, early 80s New York. And so it's just one of those films that you could place in an 80s list, but only because of its release date. Yeah, it has no sensibility from that decade at all.
Yeah, I did a show a couple of weeks ago about a Patrick Dempsey movie called Happy Together. It was written in the 80s. It was shot in the 80s. It was supposed to be distributed by MGM UA in the 80s. And then it finally came out in March of 1990. But there's absolutely nothing about the movie that is 90s. It is absolutely positively day glow color clothing, and the way that people it's absolutely an 80s movie in every way, shape, or form, except the fact that it came out 3 months or little over 2 months after the decade ended. So yeah, and it's a fascinating movie because it's like the most unsarcastic late 80s movie about romance and love, with it just, some of the characterizations stink, but it's a fun movie to watch because it is so sappily sentimental and does not care, and it rejects the sarcasm that was going to be coming in the 90s. So yeah, I understand how Cruisin' could be absolutely a 70s movie, with the exception of it was released literally in January of 1980.
Yeah, and the Sex Lies and the Videotape is like basically almost a 90s movie that's released in the 80s. And then the film that I think there are many crazy films you can't believe were made because of some of the subject matter and what they did with it. But the movie that always just gets me, like, I still just can't believe it, no matter how many times I see it. I don't watch it, but how many times I see the poster or I show clips from it as like, please never do this. It's Soul Man. It's just always Soul Man. Soul Man is one of those movies you struggle to figure out how this got written, how this was developed, and how this was greenlit and then put into production and then marketed, even in the ways which it was marketed. It's like one of those movies you just can't believe. So people will stare at, other films from the 1920s and 30s with caution and anger. This is one of those movies that, it's not going to get any better. This movie is going to continue to be
a world of suckage.
Yeah, a giant stinking fish on melting ice. It's just unbelievable, and I think it gets worse every year, actually.
I remember when it came out. I played it at the Del Mar Theater in Santa Cruz. I saw the first, and it was from New World Pictures when they were making their last push into trying to be a mini major. And I remember getting the poster and the trailer for it. And there is C. Thomas Howell with an afro and blackface, and my reaction was just, what the fuck? And then, when previews are mostly programmed by the home office, you play this trailer in front of this movie, or you play trailers A, B, and C. So and you don't have the internet. You can't go onto YouTube and watch a trailer. You have to see it in a theater. And it was like, the home office said, okay, put this in front of, I forget, made to order. And I watched the trailer, and it's just like, how did this get made? There has to be so many people who came up with the idea, who wrote the idea, who read the script at an agency or at a production company. So many eyes had to see this script in 1985, 1986, 1987. Agents getting their clients to audition to be in it, and actors who were like, do I really need this job that badly?
And James Earl Jones, who co-stars in it.
Yeah. It's like,
and there's that speech at the end of the movie, his roommate makes this speech, which is supposed to be, a movie that has this sort of, I think it thinks it's very progressive. That's the other crazy part about the movie. And then he makes this speech, and you're like, wow, do you think that's fixing this movie? Like, this is the speech where it's like, oh, okay, so this whole setup is fine because here's the speech. And the speech doesn't fix anything.
Yeah.
The movie is, it's just something, and I, just to be clear, I am absolutely not recommending anybody watch it.
No,
what
I will never recommend anybody watch it.
Yeah,
not even in a sarcastic manner, not even as a relic of the 80s.
Yeah.
Absolutely do not watch this movie under any circumstances.
But what's so interesting about the film is that it was made. And so that gives you a sense of just, when sometimes people say, wow, this, something will come out and people say, can you believe they made that? Or even movies from 10 years ago, which are before the Me Too movement or before Black Lives Matter, many other films, and people will look back 10 years ago, wow, that's a deeply problematic film. And of course, in many cases they are. Those films sometimes don't hold a candle to how deeply problematic Soul Man is. Soul Man is a really the top prize in many cases of like tone deaf Hollywood filmmaking for the last 40 years.
It killed Ray Don Chong's career. It killed C. Thomas Howell's career, and rightfully so, for making such bad decisions. And I think the only reason why it didn't kill James Earl Jones' career is because he was James Earl Jones. You know, it's like, he had already established such a track record before then that this is just considered a minor blip in his career, but really
and there has been a lot of conversation about it in recent years, where even with some of the actors who said, look, we were trying to do this, we were trying to do that, and that's the other thing. I mean, I don't know what the intentions were, and I don't want to, say that Ray Don Chong, saw it, didn't see it, thought it was great, thought it was going to be problematic, thought it was going to be, beneficial. Who knows? Mm. Whatever the comments are, there's been a conversation even amongst the actors that they feel that they've been, attacked heavily for this film, which, they felt was trying to say something important. I just think it's one of those where, just again, and I think it's because we talk about these kinds of things a lot, I think it's just interesting to go back and see that this is something that everybody went, yeah,
we're okay with this.
We're okay with this.
Yeah. For those of you who are not aware of Soul Man, first off, consider yourself lucky. I will give a brief description of the movie at the very end of the show in case you wish to remain blissfully unaware of this cinematic travesty. And once again, I am so grateful to Ross for spending some time with me to talk about our shared passions. Thank you for joining us. We'll talk again on the 16th when our next episode about the Beverly Center Cinemas, the first megaplex theater in America, is released. July 16th would have been the 40th anniversary of the theater's opening, which would change the trajectory of moviegoing for the next 40 years, had it not been closed in 2010. Remember to visit this episode's page on our website at filmjerk.com for extra materials about the movies we've covered on this episode. The 80s Movie Podcast has been researched, written, narrated, and edited by Edward Havens for Idiosyncratic Entertainment. Thank you again. Good night. Okay, Soul Man, here we go. 1980s teen heartthrob, C. Thomas Howell stars as Mark, a rich kid who's been accepted to Harvard Law School only to find out his father has decided to withdraw all financial support for his son. When the horrible prospect of having to pay to attend one of the most prestigious law schools in the country himself, Mark decides to apply for a scholarship, or more specifically, a scholarship meant to be for an African-American student. So Mark, with the help of his best friend, decides to take an unhealthy amount of tanning pills to appear to be darker skinned than the very white kid he is. At school, he meets and falls for one of his classmates, an African-American single mother who was originally supposed to get the scholarship Mark received, and now must work to help support herself and her young child while also going to law school. Mark begins to regret what he's done, but soon finds himself dealing with the same kinds of racial stereotyping and prejudice that many African-American males were then, and still are today, dealing with. The producer of the film, Steve Tisch, would defend the making of the film by comparing it to Tootsie, which used comedy to explore sexual stereotypes, while Soul Man was trying to, and I am directly quoting him here, explode racial stereotyping. And it didn't work. It's a horrible movie, and it's one that should be avoided at all costs. Good night.